Hello and welcome back to our final episode for the weekend of the DD Geopolitics podcast. I am joined by our one and only Lydia and a guest host, Tyler. And our guest for this hour is Infrared Haz. Hi, Haz. Welcome to the show.
Hi, glad to be here.
So I want to tell a little bit of backstory about why I even approached Haz. I've been following Haz for a while through his Twitter suspension and his streaming and stuff, but I was in a space with him a couple weeks ago and he was hosting and he was asking people to come debate him, and two like America First guys came in and were like, you're not white enough for our movement, and you're like, you're anti-white, and Haz was kind of like, all right, or whatever. And then an African American female came on and she's called him a Nazi white supremacist. So I was like, I gotta get this guy on the show because nobody knows what the hell to do with this guy, and he just keeps kind of getting accused of being two like completely contradictory things. So I was like, I want to have this guy on because he's just such an enigma and people don't even know how to like process him or his ideas. So I wanted to kind of have a conversation with you about that and like how you kind of feel about not people trying to box you into these places and you absolutely not fitting in at all.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's an interesting thing. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that I'm not a right winger. I'm just kind of outside of the whatever you'd call it, the leftist, echo chamber or the leftist discourse. And there's this kind of thing where, like, if you're not fully initiated into that kind of like institutional culture, then you're like you're a Nazi. You're the worst possible thing that politically correct culture justifies itself on the basis of preventing. They're like, oh yeah, we have to be politically correct or else everyone's going to become Hitler. So if you're not part of their culture, you may as well be Hitler, pretty much.
Tyler, are you there? Tyler, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I was just letting Haz kind of explain. So what got you to start the Infrared Collective with your group of people?
Yeah, so we had been kind of like a study group for a long time, actually, since like 2015, 2016, and around 2020 we just couldn't take it anymore. We weren't public, but like the discourse that we were seeing and just kind of the changes in ideology and all this new talk of Marxism, and we couldn't take how pretty much stupid American leftists were. And, we didn't really begin that combative, but we were like, okay, let's just kind of start a low key podcast and just kind of put our takes out there, but nothing really took off until I started streaming pretty much.
Right. And it has to do a lot with how they bastardize Marxism and they, misinterpret a lot of him, Engels, Lenin, Stalin's writings. That's kind of how I started to follow you, is that these people would misinterpret those works, or you guys would actually quote the original writing of what they were saying and putting it against what they were pushing into the online space, saying that this was Marxism, that this was what these great thinkers were meaning by however they were manipulating what the intention of those writings were.
Yeah, what it really was is that, okay, around 2015, 2016, you have Bernie Sanders. He's running on the basis of democratic socialism. And then you have the DSA grow. And, American leftists are unique and distinct from the historical left, in the sense that they're really passionate about sexual minorities and marginals. They're really politically correct. They're really kind of moralistic. And I'm like, okay, that's the DSA liberal Democrat kind of thing. So we kind of independently, and we didn't begin this way, by the way, but we kind of independently were like re-examining Marxism-Leninism. Because when you're a Marxist intellectual in the West, the first thing you want to do is say, real existing socialism and communism was not sophisticated enough. It was vulgar. I'm a really smart, unique intellectual, and I'm gonna kind of, I'm gonna kind of have insight where they couldn't, right? We kind of started to appreciate how, even though the writings of Stalin seem simplistic in some sense, there's a lot of wisdom there, because there's a lot of experience, concrete experience that's bounded up with. So we really started to kind of think about Marxism-Leninism in a more sophisticated and charitable way than Western Marxist intellectuals typically do. For full disclosure, the kind of background we're coming from is like, Slavoj Žižek, French theory, that kind of thing. So it's like we're beginning in a very strange place to re-examine Marxism-Leninism, right? Or at least an unorthodox place. But anyway, long story short, we started to realize, like, okay, obviously Marxism-Leninism is not politically correct. These are not like, this is not like a woke thing. We understand it historically because we're very familiar with the leftist critiques. So Stalin was too homophobic. They were too conservative. They were too patriarchal, yada, yada. Especially in comparison with the libertine morality of like the new left. So that was like a truism for us. Like, yeah, we need to rediscover Marxism-Leninism because this is not historical communism, this dumb woke shit we're seeing, around 2020 and stuff. So it comes to my like extreme shock and surprise that years after we kind of started getting into Marxism-Leninism, it somewhat becomes trendy in America. And now you have this very bizarre phenomena of, and it might not seem bizarre for others, but for us, it was very bizarre, like seeing people with a Stalin profile picture with like a trans flag. And it's like, that's not really something we like expected, because we automatically understood how this kind of trends were radically outside of Marxism-Leninism,
Right. Yeah. The way I see that sort of thing is that the Marxist left, or the post 1992 space of communism or Marxism-Leninism specifically, was just a wide open, frontier for these left groups to kind of it was a safe space, like an ideological safe space in which they were free to operate without any real criticism, because communism had fallen. The USSR had, was, disbanded, and you just had like the American left free to interpret these things any way they wanted. And over, since '08 and, the decade plus since into COVID, these ideas were unchallenged from a real orthodox Marxist-Leninist, ideological space. So I think that's why you get a lot of this, is because it was just a way for these pseudo intellectuals and these academic do nothings to sort of make communism what they wanted it to be instead of what it actually was. And the way I see infrared is a reintroduction of orthodox Marxism-Leninism and then applying that to the 21st century. So in your opinion, or in your group's vision, what do you see as Marxism-Leninism in the 21st century? Like, what does that look like to Haz?
Sure. So the way we see it is that you're beginning with classical Marxism in history, Marx and Engels, right? And this perspective is kind of like, I don't want to like attribute too much to them or impose too much on them, but it's kind of beginning from a Eurocentric perspective, just in the sense that, the revolution is going to break out in the most advanced capitalist core, England, right? Which was a prediction that did not come to fruition. And you also have a kind of Marxism that is just concerning itself with, a very strict kind of industrial proletariat, right? And then what we see in the case of Marxism-Leninism is something kind of curious. We see Lenin proposing an alliance with the peasantry, right? We see the development of something called socialism in one country, which more or less, I mean, despite the Communist Manifesto said communism or the class struggle will be national in form, but it did say that, you know, the revolution will be the simultaneous action of, you know, the advanced peoples. And this is not the case with socialism in one country. So you see a line of development going from the kind of dogmatic classical Marxism through the experience, the concrete experience of Marxism-Leninism, through the Russian experience, through the Chinese experience, and so on and so on. And so we want to approach Marxism from the perspective of this kind of teleology of what is driving it, what is true about Marxism that drives it in this direction, in contrast to the kind of vulgar interpretation of classical Marxism or orthodox Marxism even. So we are Marxist-Leninists because that is a concrete index of the historical experience so far. But we don't see it as a dogma as much as we see it as a kind of like, this is what has been accomplished both in theory and practice so far, and it's unfinished. And that's a very important kind of thing that makes it so that you have so-called Orthodox Marxist-Leninists like the Greek, the Communist Party of Greece. They don't like us, you know, they see us as heretics pretty much, especially because they're kind of doing this thing where they're like, oh yeah, the special military operation is an inter-imperialist war. This is just like World War I. And we radically depart from that kind of perspective. We also welcome Deng Xiaoping's reforms and, you know, the Chinese experience of Chinese socialism as a legitimate development of the history of communism and socialism. So when we say we're Orthodox Marxist-Leninists, it's more in the sense of we think this is leading up to a conclusion, which has not exactly been drawn out in any definite or exact way thus far. And this is, Infrared wants to do this. We want to participate in this kind of discovery of what is the real ends toward which this development has been striving.
Right. The way I see it is that theory has to it has to adhere to reality and not the other way. Reality does not have to adhere to theory because it's just it's ideological jargon until it's practiced in the real world in a real sense, in the political sense especially, which does not always match up to the reality of theory. So the way I see it is that Marxism-Leninism is adhering to particular principles in which humanity or civilization under communist dictatorship tries to advance forward and liberate the masses and the people and accelerate the forces of production. So the way I would see it is that Mao is rectified by Deng Xiaoping's reforms, which are rectified by Xi Jinping's sort of, I don't want to say like deliberalization, but sort of removing sort of the maybe liberal excess that was brought into reform and opening up. And I see this is where one of the biggest schisms are between Infrared and the online, radical ultra left, where this differs in interpretation. They seem to be stuck in 1990 whatever, where you had China almost completely would appear to be fully liberalized, and then the USSR is completely dismantled and exposed to capitalist shock therapy, to which the selling away of all that public or nationalized infrastructure into the hands of these capitalist oligarchs in the West. So I see that these people tend to be stuck in like the 90s or 2000s. And then you guys seem to operate from a space that takes over with the, I don't want to say re-emergence of China, but the strengthening of China as the U.S. empire wanes. So would you say that China and well, I guess China would be the successor of the Marxist-Leninist tradition. Would you say that they are the driving force of 21st century communism, like in actuality? Because there's a lot of confusion to what China is in the 21st century. People tend to be very confused about what it is. They're like, oh, well, it's successful, so it's capitalist because of all these, liberalized reforms. But they call it communism whenever they do something bad or they adhere to a certain strict authority from the Communist Party.
Yeah, I would say China has played a very important role for us in terms of the inspiration for understanding the contemporary significance of communism, and especially in practice, right? The view that communism can be compatible with a very dynamic, kind of, in some regards, decentralized market economy. So that is a very important thing. And we do glean very important philosophical and theoretical insights from the kind of line of succession of Mao, Deng, Xi, right? We draw out a very special significance of that, especially because, just not to do a detour, but it's like we have a culture war going on in the West, in the US especially, right? And when you study the history of the Cultural Revolution in China, you can't help but get the feeling that this is just a farcical repetition of that. It's not really a repetition, because the Cultural Revolution was not like led by pink-haired baristas, it was led by like newly urbanized and educated peasants in the cities, and then it actually involved masses and masses of peasants. But it is this kind of like looking for the utopia through culture, I guess, very vaguely. This kind of attempt to initiate a revolution in culture. You see this in the West, so you can't help but get the feeling that, or not the feeling, sorry, derive the insight that, like China is ahead of where America is today. They've already found a resolution of that kind of problem of how do we make compatible our ideological vision, our kind of moral vision with reality, right? Because reality is not premised by our conditions of morality and our conditions of ideology, right? So how do you deal with that dialectic? And I think there's a very brilliant way in which China has accomplished this historically. But that aside, it's not just China that for us had this significance for the revival of Marxism-Leninism. It was especially also, I think, Russia, actually, because it was from an analysis of Russia that we were able to draw the conclusion of an objective significance of Marxism-Leninism. Remember, we were not seeing Marxism-Leninism as just an ideology. We saw it as like this index of concrete historical experience, which in many ways is irreversible. So when you look at a country like Russia, which is not ideologically Marxist-Leninist, right? There is no ruling communist party, but you do see an objective significance of the communist experience there that just is not reversible. At the geopolitical level, in many ways, you could say that's driving forth the recent developments with the special military operation. Even internally within Russian domestic politics, there is just this big question mark of how do we succeed this prior mode of production? I mean, you have a state-owned energy industry, which so far has been sustaining the economy, but in terms of like I feel like a lot of people underestimate the extent to which like Russia has not really found a definitive economic system. I don't think. I think it's kind of a kind of mixture of different things, all with different geopolitical implications. And so there you see the most strongly this acute contradiction, which is, on the one hand, Marxism-Leninism is this irreversible, concrete experience and transformation of civilization. And on the other hand, it is not necessarily reflected ideologically that way, right? So that is a big that is of great significance for us, because when we, for example, are analyzing the revolutionary potential of the American masses, we also have to reckon with the fact that, yes, ideologically, they're not automatically disposed to our views, right? But there, on the objective level, there is something there that I think Marxism or Marxism-Leninism is trying to speak to or articulate in some sense, right? So I
Right.
think it's important to situate China in a Chinese context. I don't think socialism is completely applicable to everywhere in the world. I think Russia has maybe a more immediate significance for the Western world, at least, because after all, it was Russia that is leading this kind of global revolution against the unipolar system, at least
Right.
politically.
Right. And I do think you can see that people tend to sympathize in the West a little bit more with Russia, or at least in the American sense, because, they're, laundering our tax money to fight this illegal war and this encroachment on Russian sovereignty. So in doing that, it sort of they cut Russia off from the, entanglement with the West. Now any sort of business dealing has to be through almost mediated through a third party, and you see that with the exports of natural gas and oil and various Russian commodities to which they're very rich with, and they have to get it into the market somehow. But I do think this is a very interesting thing in that Russia cannot exist within the Western context because it has already taken that sort of step forward in which they had their 1917 revolution. They underwent the transformation into a sort of state capitalism in an attempt to transition into a real socialist mode of production, and they sort of accomplished that. But they you had Khrushchev, who sort of entirely did a 360 towards what Stalin and the communist movement was up until that point, and they sort of revised it, and then it did not adhere to sort of like the ideology of Marxism-Leninism any forward. So it is interesting that Russia still has to grasp or reckon with its previous identity, because it no longer fits within the Western neoliberal capitalism or whatever you want to call it in this 21st century context. But it culturally, economically, and ideologically, it seems to differ from the West very much. And I think that sort of where you guys are coming from, in which you use thinkers like Dugin, Heidegger, some of these thinkers that are outside of the Marxist-Leninist tradition. So I think you use Professor Dugin's works in a way that as a lens to see Marxism-Leninism through, because the way I see it is that people that lived under the Soviet Union, they cannot help but see things through this Soviet lens, despite all the changes that have taken through. It's like it fits in with the idea, the infrared, hypothesis that you can't reverse a mode of production, in which they can't go back to simply what is capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, because the base does not match the superstructure. So they are in like.
Yeah, and not to cut you off, but just a really quick example of that should be obvious is like when you try a Western model of liberalization in Russia, you see what happens. Because the forces of production have been irreversibly socialized, instead of having this kind of individualistic free market economy, you have oligarchs. You just have people who still concentrate and centralize the productive forces, and still they're just as socialized as before in scale. It's just that they're kind of owned by a handful of people, right? Like if you will, a bunch of mini communist parties, or even, I don't want to insult Stalin, but like mini pygmy Stalins, right? So there is something irreversible about the Soviet socialism. And you see this even today in Russia. You look at the Russian economy and how much of it is state owned. I think, don't quote me, I think it's at least around half. I don't know if that's exactly true. I know the energy industry, the energy sector is foundational for the economy, and that is in large part state owned. So yeah, I mean that's a great example of what we're talking about there.
You brought up SMO, the special military operation. I kind of want to get your like perspective on what, you know, how you feel about the special military operation and what it's doing, pushing discourse in a certain direction, or what changes have you seen, maybe for your philosophy or just in general?
It's kind of funny because the SMO was not a shock to us. It was a complete confirmation and vindication of what we were anticipating and expecting, because like we were giving this newfound significance to Russia from this kind of Marxist-Leninist perspective, talking about its world historical importance. And then everyone was saying, what do you mean Russia's not communist anymore? They're not relevant anymore. Their economy is the size of Italy. But we understood that, you know, there is something true as reflected in the works of people like Dugin, where on a civilizational level, Russia represents a different world than the West. It's a different polarity, right? And this will have radical consequences. So when it came to the SMO, I mean, to put it short, I got banned on Twitch for being a Kremlin propagandist. So right off the bat, I was covering it in a way hostile to the Azovites, right? The liberal Azovites is what I like to call them. But to draw attention to it, our analysis from the Marxist perspective, more or less the view is this, that Putin in Russian context was a kind of bare minimum of sovereignty. He was almost a centrist. Many people do not appreciate that in Russia, Putin is not like some dictator quelling this spontaneous tendency toward Western individualism and liberalism. The political forces in Russia, which rival Putin, very much, I would think, are more anti-Western than he is actually. Like, for example, number two in almost every election, and the second largest party, as we know, the Communist Party. And then outside the Communist Party, you have the far right, the ultranationalists, and so on and so on. So this notion that Putin is like the man that's behind this kind of Russian boldness and Russian hostility to the West is just silly, right? But anyway, the war in the Donbass has been going on for, you know, a decade, about a decade, right? And it has exerted tremendous internal pressure to the government, right? On a grassroots popular level, almost, at least in terms of the discourse and so on that goes on in Russia. Like, it was the Communist Party, actually, which was constantly petitioning and requesting the Russian government to intervene on behalf of the Donbass republics. And the Russian government had been very reluctant to do that. I mean, they went into Crimea. People in the Donbass were expecting something similar for Donbass, and it never happened, right? So the Russian government has tried to maintain the status quo and stability at all costs. When people say Putin is a madman, I think it's an extreme stupidity on their part. Putin has been trying his best to kind of keep the status quo, I think, actually. There's very fine line between Russian sovereignty and important business ties to the West, specifically in the form of the pipelines, right? Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2. So he's been walking that fine line. So this is why they tried Minsk, they tried Minsk 2. And finally, when because Ukraine's a different dynamic. Ukraine, oh, it's a democracy, but it's the people with guns who exert the most pressure in defining policy there, right? So that's the Azov militias fighting in the Donbass. They have the de facto sovereignty. And there's also a pressure inside of Ukraine to retake the Donbass and Crimea, right? So at a certain point, and then also, okay, when you put in the context of NATO and that whole wider context, that at a certain point, I think Putin, the Russian government, was forced to begin the SMO. So what significance do I draw from that, from the Marxist perspective? It's simple. This special military operation was done on the basis of popular pressure. It was not done on behalf of the vested interests of the so-called oligarchs and these other business interests. I mean, it's just a stupid analysis by leftists and these so-called communists, the Greek Communist Party. They say, oh, this is serving the ruling capitalist class in Russia. And then how? You know, those are the ones who got, you know, completely I don't want to swear, but they got completely they lost big time, right? I'll say that, because of the sanctions, because of the cutting of relations with the West. And so Putin is doing this on a popular mandate. I think that was very clear to me from the beginning. And there is no private interest in Russia. This is what I mean to say, that stands to benefit from the SMO. And, you know, not to be too cynical, and, you know, I'm not someone who will criticize Russia's conduct, because what business is it of mine, right? But I have a small suspicion that the reason the SMO has been prolonged, or there seems to be this kind of confusion, maybe is because the ruling circles in Russia, like economically at least, are not fully on board with it, right? So I think that's an interesting dynamic. So I think from a Marx or from a communist perspective, it's a no-brainer. This is why the Communist Party in Russia has this line that yes, the SMO is anti-imperialist. It's not something that was done on behalf of the ruling class in Russia.
I'm glad you brought that up. Because Lydia's here with us and she's in Siberia. So I think she could bring a unique perspective about the ideas within the borders of Russia in regards to the special military operations, maybe in the same lens that you're looking at it from.
Well, I definitely agree when people say that somehow they make it out to be this imperialist war, supposedly, that Russia wanted to do. It couldn't be further from the truth. I actually agree that probably most people in power had no interest in it. Because let's face it, I kind of talked about it with one of my friends recently. That when we talk about the special military operation, the people let me start from slightly different point. Sometimes, you know, a lot of, let's put it, not even Ukraine supporters, full on Ukraine supporters, but kind of those people who are in the middle, they're undecided, and the people who I call, you know, I like peace, I don't like war. They like to say, well, but wasn't there any other way? Uh, why did it have to be a war? But to which the way I kind of see it, which is what I was talking about with my friend, Russia was largely, in my opinion, in a situation where there was no good option. So there were several options, I guess, how we could have handled it, but neither one of them was particularly good or perfect. Let's put it this way. And as far as popular support, I'll say this. As a Russian, sometimes I feel like, and that's very understandable, because I find that people on average, when they're looking at Russia from the outside in, they see us as this more homogenous society, I would say. And so I often hear this analysis of people saying, oh, Russians, they all support this, or Russians, they all don't like that. When in reality, the Russian society is pretty nuanced and pretty diverse. And so when we say that the decision to launch the SMO was popular, even on the, on the people level, I wouldn't actually say that was the case, because you kind of said that you were expecting it. And I wouldn't say that it was a complete surprise for Russians, because obviously there were, it didn't happen overnight. There was troop buildup over the months, and but still, I will say that for most people in Russia, when it happened, it was a surprise. It was a shock, and maybe even the people who expected it to happen, they didn't expect it to happen on this scale. They maybe expected well, obviously, since we recognize the republics, they expected us to maybe send the troops there and to kind of, to protect them or to do something along those lines, kind of, Crimea style. But definitely people didn't expect it to be an operation on this scale. And so even within the society, there are people who are, even if they're very much for the idea and what Russia stands for and why, and they recognize that we had no other choice, or no other better choice, we should say, they still have their doubts, and they still, maybe, part of them, because we were hit pretty hard, especially initially, maybe there were moments for them when they wished, that it never happened. So that's kind of how I see it. But I imagine that among the elites, there was probably even less political will to go through with it.
Yeah, I don't mean to paint all Russians with a broad brush, but I would like to ask you, where do you think the necessity, politically speaking, of the SMO came from? Was it just the expertise of Putin, or do you think there was maybe consideration of the impact a lack of action would have on maybe the popularity of the government and the president and so on? What do you think was the driving internal factor? Because all I am certain of is that I just know that it could not have been the so-called ruling class and so-called oligarchs, as Western leftists say. I just, from what everything I have come to study and analyze about the situation, that just doesn't make any logical sense. But if it's not from some kind of popular pressure, at least an anticipated popular pressure, like in the long term, when you consider how this has been raging on for a decade, and the implications from that. So I'm curious what your thoughts on that are.
Well, I definitely agree with you, and to kind of comment on what you said, I didn't mean to imply that you were painting Russians with this, white brush. I just say that a lot of people do. Um, See, from my perspective, and I don't claim to understand everything, but that's just kind of my feeling about this whole situation, is that basically the government, and we could say the president, so that basically we either do it now, or it will, there won't be a better moment for us. It got to the point where we had to do it. And then, because let's face it, he is pretty popular in Russia. He has enough credit, let's put it this way, with the people, to where he could risk it, even something big as this. And he knew that even if the people, let's say, I'm not going to give you the percentage because I have no idea, but even if all the people were not exactly on board with it, they have enough trust and enough understanding and obviously enough compassion for the people in the Donbass, where they would eventually come around to this. That's my take. So actually, yeah, so I guess that's the best way how I can describe. I feel like they knew that they wouldn't have a better chance and they had to risk it.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I was I am just always curious about like thinking of this in the class dynamics of, maybe that's a little too cynical, but I like to think of it in terms of like who stands to benefit from it, or was it really just something done from the perspective of the state and this kind of interest of state sovereignty, without necessarily taking into consideration too much the uh, the popularity. So
I actually think, I think I agree with this. I think that it was a major security threat. It was a threat to the sovereignty of the nation. When you have a threat like that, an existential threat, you have to do very risky things regardless. So it's not, it's not a matter of who benefits. And like I said before, and like you said before, the idea that somehow the oligarchs would benefit from it is ridiculous, because you don't have to be uh, exactly politically savvy to understand that people who, let's put it this way, who have a lot of investment in the West, a lot of ties with the West, in what ways would they ever benefit from something like this? It's just very strange to me that some people believe in it.
What about you, Tyler? What do you think about the SMO kind of like in this vision, like from the working class lens?
Within America, in the U.S., or under
Wherever,
what context?
in general.
Um, so yeah, no, it's Russia was, sort of forced to make some sort of intervention in, Ukraine, Donbass, and it seems like NATO or the West may have baited them into that. Maybe that's what they wanted, or maybe they didn't really anticipate such a, strong reaction from Russia. They thought they could, maybe bully Russia or impose its, continue to subvert its interests by, encircling it and escalating tensions. So the way I see it is that you have the West, astroturfing Ukraine and NATO, escalating this issue on one side, and then you have Russia, who has been, maybe not reluctant to try to help, their fellow Russian, people in the Donbass and Eastern Ukraine, but it seems like they were hesitant because they understand that of, the power of the West and NATO, and what the, bigger picture is in trying to dismantle Russia, and that's what they've been trying to do for 30 years. And I think in 2022 you had this, uh, very direct schism. It's just like enough is enough. Enough with this, constant encroachment on our sovereignty, on our way of life, on our, on Russia for Russians and, Russian-speaking people within, Eastern Europe and Ukraine. So I think this escalation, it happened over the course of the, last year, and that I don't think they really had the full intention to go really occupy all of Ukraine and, go full shock and awe like you see with, the U.S. war in Iraq. It's almost incomparable. Russia's been very surgical in how they, approach, combatants and, military infrastructure. There's always going to be collateral damage, but it seems like they have taken a great, sense of carefulness in, not destroying their ancestral homeland, which I think I think Dugan talks about that a little bit, is that they're, it's one and the same. They a lot of Ukrainians are Russian, and Russia comes from Ukraine, so they can't, you can't, politically you can't just go carpet bomb your, ancestral homeland. The biggest issue that I see is that it seems like the political or upper brass of the military is, I don't know, they're playing the long game for sure, but it's hard to decipher from what sort of perspective. So if you look at it from a Marxist perspective, I can see why the Western left sort of approaches it this way, where they just see these oligarchical influences that Putin they see him as a part of, rather than him keeping them at bay and keeping their sort of interests under Russian sovereignty. So it seems that uh, there's some sort of issue there, and I don't know if they're just hesitant to go too far into this to escalate themselves, or if it is just biding their time, letting the West waste all its resources and excess surplus that they've stored for 40 years since the end of the Cold War, or towards the part where they realized that no escalation with Russia was ever going to happen in the cataclysmic context of like a World War III. So that's the way I see it. And Haz, how would you say that 2022 was like? You have this idea of MAGA communism, and it seems very inherently contradictory. And as you've stated, it's more of a syncretic understanding or interpretation of things, rather than an ideology. The people, the Western leftists, see this as like it's an ideology and it's nonsensical. Would you say that it was created as a result of the Russian SMO, this sort of geopolitical split, or this divide between East and West?
I think the SMO was undoubtedly a factor in revealing political fault lines, which we've anticipated previously, but which did not make themselves apparent until the SMO, exactly apparent at least. We speculated that the Western, basically our theory was, it's very simplistic, but roughly accurate, very roughly, like at least in some regard, that left and right in the East and in the West are swapped. They're swapped. The right wing in the kind of China and to some minor, I know Russia's a lot more complicated. I'm very aware that like Russia has a left, which is like a Western left, but they also have a left which is a Russian left, right? I would argue, at least. But in any case, traditionally, like the left in the East is kind of conservative in its cultural outlook. It's very patriotic. It's very much rooted in the people. It's at least aspires to be popular, right? In character. The left in the West is very elitist. It's very culturally elitist. It's kind of hates the backward, unwashed masses who are, unenlightened with regard to the kind of latest trends of internet and academia and so on and so on. It's very much kind of like the right wing in a lot of countries, actually, right? So basically, combining this with the situation in Ukraine, like the alignment of forces in Ukraine, where liberalism is allied to neo-Nazism, like openly, right? It became clear to us that the Western left is, to the extent that it is radical, is Azovite. Like when they say, we need to push Biden left, it's like, oh, you mean maybe a different direction, right? like these people who are more leftist than the Democrats are like, oh, you're kind of, you're like what the Azov battalion is for the Ukrainian government. You're these kind of extreme radicals who want to use violence to kind of stamp out the subhumans, inferiors, who are not human enough or Western enough to be considered part of your political body, right? This is what you have in Ukraine. It's like you have so many of these. I mean, you have this transgender, not to hate trend, I don't hate anyone, but it just speaks to the level of compatibility with Western sentiment, the kind of transgender woman who's now fighting alongside the Nazis in Ukraine. I forgot their name. But it's like this speaks to this kind of framing of like which we knew beforehand, which is that it's a reinvention of European supremacism and Nazism. We're open, we're tolerant, we're enlightened, we go on Reddit, we are pro-LGBT, we're open-minded, and you Russians, Chinese, Africans, whatever, Arabs, you are backward, you're intolerant, you are closed societies, right? I mean, is it this geopolitically, this is just a reproduction of the classical colonial dynamic, and then in the European context, of course, Nazism. I mean, this is really what the Nazis thought of the Russians and the Slavs to their east, that they're backward, they're not as civilized as us, they're not as conscientious as us. So, okay, so you take that to the internal, like you take this frame in the domestic level in America, it's very similar. The rednecks and the working poor are backward, subhuman, whatever, and we are the kind of enlightened ones. So I just, from that very rudimentary framing of things, because of the SMO, I mean, Maga communism became very clear. Like, yes, okay, let's put our ideological biases aside. Let's put this ideological neuroticism, let's shelve it, and let's just kind of, with sober senses, ask the basic question. If in America, like if we had a real left, if we had the equivalent of like, the Communist Party in China, or even the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, like what social forces would they be based in? Where would they align? And it's just like so evident that it would be with MAGA, right? But then when you look at this geopolitical angle, it's literally true. Like MAGA people are the ones who seem to be the most aligned with the anti-globalist, if you want to call it that, anti-unipolar forces globally, right? I mean, yeah, people like to talk about how there's a lot of anti-China sentiment, but actually read between the lines. Do Trump supporters generally, or MAGA people, or conservatives, whatever, do they, generally speaking, do they want to go to war with China over Taiwan? Do they care about human rights and democracy? I mean, there's a lot of fear-mongering about different countries, but it's like, it's never framed in the way that actually successfully justifies imperialism. It's always framed in a way of, oh, we just kind of need to be vigilant of this threat on our shores, which is a complete myth. It's nonsense. But, when Nancy Pelosi lands in Taiwan, and then even Trump condemns it as insanity, it's like, it's very clear where the alignment of forces are in this country. And there's a lot of ideological nonsense that gets in the way of being able to just see the plain reality of it, because people are stupid. They just look at it in a surface level way. MAGA people speak ill of communism. They're right wing, so that's it. And it's like, well, you don't have that sixth sense which allows you to actually see how the world actually works, and what these things actually mean for these different groups of people.
Right. And I think with Trump, he seems a little bit contradictory on China in a lot of ways. Like he'll, saber rattle them. He'll talk about how, they're doing this, they're doing that to subvert the US. But then he talks very positively about Xi Jinping and some of the transformations that have taken effect in China. So it's very bizarre and I see why people get confused about this idea, because his base is very anti-communist in a general sense. But it seems like when you like you demonstrated when you went to the MAGA rally last year, is that they are not unfriendly to these ideas when you present them in a way that doesn't trigger them. It seems like they're like most Americans, they're trained to respond to stimuli rather than, maybe the substance of what these ideas mean. So in sort of unraveling that, sort of revelation, what do you see infrared, or, I'm aware that you've stated that you're in the process of creating a new, organization. um, is that something that your organization is seeking to sort of take upon, is sort of showing, this group of people and Americans in general, working class Americans, wherever they might lie, that these ideas are something that would be beneficial to the American system and the American working class as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. It's so difficult to get this point across because like people on the internet are just not a very smart bunch. Most people kind of just very much what do you call it? What do you call this? They have sorry, I didn't get any sleep. What is it called? It's called low attention span. They don't want to think about things past the surface, right? So when Trump or Maga people talk badly about communism, oh, that they're talking about the idea. They're talking about this platonic ideal, right? And it's like, okay, but then use common sense. Just one next order or layer of thinking, which is very hard to demand of people, which is, okay, what do they mean by that though? Like, what do they actually are they actually referring to like the platonic eternal idea of communism? Or are they talking about like the Rockefellers and the FBI and the CIA and this kind of bare minimum of liberal authoritarianism, which they don't have a word for besides what they've inherited from their grandparents from the Cold War, which is, I mean, they're using the same term to apply to a radically different situation just because it's like ready at hand. It's just their way of making sense of things. But does that reflect like an intrinsic experience with communism? I mean, are these actual communists they're talking about? Is there an actual real phenomena of communism in the US that they are hostile to? And of course there isn't, right? So I just kind of find it a little infuriating when people will come to me and they'll be like, "You're such an idiot. How can you propose spreading the ideas of communism to MAGA people when they are so hostile to it?" I'm like, but words they don't have a universal meaning. They don't. It's like, do you think there's just a dictionary transplanted in their brain that's shared by everyone in the world? And this is what they mean by communism is the same thing as what Karl Marx meant? Or so I just find it so silly. But yeah, I mean, the organization I'm building is premised on the basis of not simply disseminating communist ideas, but proving in practice to people what communism is. So the organization is going to be engaged in what I like to call public works, right? We're going to go to small rural communities and basically give a lending hand to people, help people out in whatever small ways we can. You can call it charity, but I think in some regards it's more than that. It's using it's this is going to sound so crazy. It's like I'm almost a little inspired by that guy Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, you guys know who that is, or do I have to?
Wait. Yeah, go ahead. I'm really
Yeah.
interested in hearing this. Go ahead.
Yeah, so he's like grown this giant platform because he just gives out money. He just gives out money for free, right? Like I think there's something proto-communist about that. And it seems like a really like stupid analysis, but it's like if you
No, I
replace
love this. You find communism in everything, and I find it so great because it is there, and most people don't realize it. But yeah, go ahead, because I want to bring up another after
I
this.
don't just find it communist because he's like spreading the wealth. I find it communist because he's like he is growing this like almost a movement on the basis of on the basis of giving and expending, which is like, how is he making a profit if he's doing that, right? So I think, but because why is he making a profit? Because he is spending money, but at the same time, he's growing a social capital, right? So I think there's something communists should learn from that. Maybe so, not in terms of giving out money, but if you replace giving out money with engaging in good acts of, maybe you can call it charity. I like to call it public works, or good works, even if you want to take a religious tone to it. But I use my internet platform to bring people to remote locations, maybe clean up some yards, clean up some trash. I mean, help people solve problems where they just need labor, right? They just need labor. And we do this, and then we also put it on social media, and we spread the word and awareness. And I think that I'm interested in maybe starting a movement on the basis of something like that, inspiring others to do it. And the organization is decentralized for that reason. It's going to incentivize people to form chapters and clubs, to engage in these good works, to spread the message of what they're doing, and basically a model of growing a movement on that basis of public works is the main angle, right? And with public works comes a bunch of other things. It comes with holding events one day, I have a crazy idea too. This is more long term. If we're successful, it's very American, and it's also sounds crazy. Carnivals, like hosting carnivals, right? If it could get to that point. This is how I think about building a communist movement in the US. I don't think about it in terms of like because most people have this model of like, I just want to get more members and recruit people to my cult. And it's like, well, no, the people who are in your group are the ones who are going to be like dedicating the most amount of effort to doing something else, which is growing the influence of the group, right? It's not about just recruiting new members. It's about expanding the reach and the impact your organization has on the public. So the model of growth is going to be based on internet, digital media. It's going to be based on decentralized kind of association and organization. And it's also going to be based on working for the people, more or less, right? And this is the basic. And by the way, one last thing, I don't mean to ramble, but we wanted this for the CPUSA. Our plan was to take over the CPUSA so that we could actually have a communist party that does this. It'd be very easy to effectively grow a communist party on this strategy, in my view. But they've like done a lot of sketchy. They're delaying the elections like a year out past what we'd expect. So I'm like, you know what? A lot of people are sitting around doing nothing. They want to somehow work to realize, the virtues of this idea. They want to kind of like engage in some kind of action that is pursuant to and with this vision. So it's like we should just launch our own shadow party, if you will, and do these things in the name of the Communist Party and grow its reputation in a way that we see fit, because all they do is vote Democrat, and that's just so sad and pathetic.
Before we wrap, I have to ask this. Could you please tell our listeners why Richmond, north of Richmond, is a working class song?
Yeah, that's another crazy thing. So I posted the clip of that like when it first came out, and I had all these people like quote tweeting me like, "Oh my God, it's not about class war, you fucking retard," and all this shit. And it's like Jack Posobiec is coming after me, all these like conservative grifters. And it's like, okay, you go in the comment section of that video of a guy singing about the rich men north of Richmond and singing about like the ailments of the working man. So from a common sense perspective, yeah, this is about some kind of class struggle. This is about the working class, right? You go and read the comments, it's people being like, yeah, I work in like a steel mill and I'm like, overworked. I've got so much bills to pay. I'm struggling to feed my family. This resonated with me so much, yada, yada. Okay, so like this is an example of like how ideology harms people's ability to just see common sense, because then people put this ideological wool over their face, and they're like, oh, actually, this guy's a kulak because he owns this huge farm, and he's actually speaking on behalf of the interests of rich farmers. And then you have right-wing people saying, no, he's actually just talking only about politicians, and there's no class dimension to that at all, because obviously rich politicians are of the same class as a fucking factory worker in Virginia or something. So it's like, I'm kind of just baffled that I have to go on Twitter and like argue with people about this shit when I feel like 99% of people can see clearly like what it is, you know?
I hadn't heard the song, but I saw your post about it, and I went and listened to the song, and I was like, oh, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And it was just so funny to see all this pushback. And it's like, what's wrong with it being a working class anthem? Are you just like, it was just a very strange.
If you can believe it, like I even kind of doubt myself sometimes. I'm like, damn, that I must have gotten something wrong if this many, because I thought it was common sense. And then recently, he just drops a video literally saying all of my songs about class, which are about class, are about defending the poor. He names these lyrics where he's talking about the poor getting poorer, the rich getting richer. He says, I'm really disappointed to see all these like conservative or right-wing media people claim me as one of their own. I don't like how Fox News and these Republican politicians are trying to spin it in their own way, when I was also talking about them. And I'm like, so I was right. And it's like, usually when you're vindicated about something, that should calm you down and you should be happy. But actually made me more angry, because it's like, so what did I get all those people counter signaling me for? Like, what was that for? Do I get like paid now? Do I get compensation? You know, I'm thinking about going to Jack Posobiec's house, knocking on his door, and you know, where's my money? He owes me a debt. You know,
A little bit,
Yeah.
he does. Well, I really actually I enjoyed this episode a lot. This was a really good episode.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it too.
You'll have to come back. Tyler, how do you feel about your first guest hosting gig?
Oh, tremendous. Thank you very much, Dee Dee. And thank you very much, Haz, for coming on. I mean, you two are some of the most influential and, inspirational people that I've come across just within the last, couple years, in which you're both very educational, and you try to bring the truth to people in a very genuine way. And a lot of people try to twist this or try to make some of you seem like you're not what you're about, but I've seen nothing but absolute genuine attempts to not only search for the truth, find out what's real, what's not, and then try to separate fact from fiction in a very rigorous way, in a way that's not surface level, in a way that goes the extra step or the extra mile in order to present this to people so that they can have a more meaningful understanding of the events unfolding around them, because they're very complex. They're not simple. They're not these are multifaceted issues in which both of you have gone to great lengths in sort of just breaking down for the average person or layman, and just pure education in the most genuine way. So, I thank you very much for both, putting this on together. And I think there's, a lot of good that can come from something like this.
Well, I think that there's no better way to end the episode than with Tyler showering praise upon both of us. What do you, I think Haz would agree.
Oh yeah, thank you. Appreciate the words, man.
Yes, thank you, Tyler, and thank you, Lydia. I think we put her to sleep, and this has been another episode.
No, you didn't.
This has been another episode of the DD Geopolitics podcast. Until next time.